Now, folks, we've been talking about the Chinese Communist Party and its potential interference in the 2020 elections. We're sitting here now with Rick Fisher. He's one of the top experts on the Chinese Communist Party and its military agendas. And so, Rick, it's a real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Thank you, Josh.
Now, we've talked, for example, about on the show that there is hardware from China in some of these voting systems that are being used in the U.S. elections. And looking into the fact that, for example, we just had this big talk about TikTok and WeChat, and also talk about supply chain threats from Chinese systems in U.S. government purchases. Based on these concerns, now what would the concern be of Chinese hardware in election systems?
Okay, what should be the concern regarding Chinese hardware in election systems? Well, for over 15 years, the United States government has had a policy of forbidding Chinese computers from the company Lenovo from having any connection to American classified computer networks. 15 years ago, the U.S. government discovered and decided that Lenovo computers contained backdoors and spyware that would allow Chinese intelligence services to exploit whatever access they would have to classified American computer networks. So no more Lenovo computers. Since then, the concern about Chinese hardware being used to facilitate Chinese intelligence operations, Chinese cyber warfare operations, manipulation of not just voting machines, but the entire electronic infrastructure from stoplights to nuclear power plants. If there is Chinese computer hardware in your system, there is a potential for China to manipulate that hardware, manipulate its access via that hardware to gain access to your system. So if a voting machine would have Chinese components, it is at least possible in theory that a bad actor could go to that voting machine, insert a program that would affect the vote count in favor of a friend of China. That is a real concern, and it's a concern not just in the United States, but very recently it is a concern held by many citizens of the country of the Republic of Korea, South Korea. On April 15, 2020, there was a National Assembly election. The winners, overwhelmingly, was the party that favored better relations with China. However, the voting system in South Korea is controlled by an independent election commission, supposedly independent, but largely controlled by the incumbent party, the party that favors better relations with China. So that election commission has not allowed access to servers that it uses that were made in China by Huawei. And this has produced the concern in South Korea that the election result was somehow manipulated on those servers. This is a real concern. It's not been proved because all sides have not had access to those Chinese-made servers. Therefore, when you consider that many, actually the majority of voting machines in the United States also use Chinese-made components, computer chips, other aspects to allow these machines to function, screens and such, it becomes a real concern that the Chinese components in the American voting machines create vulnerabilities that could be manipulated by either a knowing American agent or by an external agent that would have some kind of either access to the individual voting machine or access to the voting machine via its connections to a computer network.
Now, based on what has been said under both the Obama administration and the Trump administration, going back to, for example, Obama administration, they're talking about supply chain threats to the U.S. military, equipment coming from China. They were warning about risks of backdoors into the systems. Trump as well has talked about this. This has been a bipartisan issue, the potential through which China, with the supply chain threats, hardware, could access, manipulate, and so on, data or control different systems through this hardware. Would that concern also apply to these voting machines based on the same premise, or would this be a different case? What's your take on this?
If there is Chinese hardware in American voting machines, then there is automatically a concern about potential manipulation. An individual voting machine not connected to a network can be programmed to favor a certain outcome. It could potentially be manipulated by an actor affected by China. Somebody simply paid off to manipulate that voting machine and would have access to codes that would not necessarily be detected if you tried to analyze the machine to try to prove fraud. If the machine was connected to a network, then the task of gaining access by Chinese or other actors would be assisted by knowledge of backdoors or other program-related doors that would be built into the Chinese hardware installed in the machine.
Now, of course, we talked about Lenovo and previous cases of this. There have been cases, for example, with Chinese-made smartphones having backdoors like this, Chinese-made routers having problems like this. How broad is the threat of backdoors like this? Oftentimes, what appear to be just security vulnerabilities in these systems that are so obvious that they seem to be intentional. How common are these types of backdoors in Chinese hardware?
Sadly, China has a broad, pervasive policy of using any access that it has to a target society to manipulate that society. Using cell phones, computer hardware, computer chips, the screens that are largely made in China, equipping them with backdoor codes that can then access other parts of a computer or a phone. That is well-established Chinese policy. It is promoted by the party. It is promoted by the People's Liberation Army. It is the patriotic duty of Chinese companies to follow orders from the military and intelligence organs to create backdoors wherever possible. This is a pervasive Chinese policy. If your phone, your computer, your computer screen is made in China, you are vulnerable to manipulation.
Now, I know Chinese companies often say that, they have no ties to the Chinese military, they have no ties to the Chinese Communist Party. To what extent could private or technically private companies in China be nationalized for the interests of the CCP?
There are no private companies in China. Every company has at least one Communist Party cell that operates in that company. Even if you have the company has 4 members. 2 or 3 of them will be the Communist Party cell. And it is the Communist Party cell within a company that also makes decisions, exercises leadership, and makes demands of that company. So a company like Huawei, which was actually an offshoot of the People's Liberation Army, subsidized and supported, given vast market share inside China so that it could position itself for global competition. That is not a private company. They may say they are, but they are an appendage of the Chinese Communist Party. They advance the broad goals of the Chinese Communist Party in most everything they do. And so Huawei, ZTE, apps that you download like TikTok, all of these are Chinese companies that have Chinese Communist Party cells that follow the dictates of the Chinese Communist Party.
Now, we often hear about Chinese political warfare, things like unrestricted warfare doctrine, China 2025, the, say, China model they're trying to export to the world and the means to achieve that. When we talk about Chinese political warfare, and the CCP does have branches of its military and government working on this, how does this look in practice? What does political warfare look in practice? What does it look like in practice?
Chinese political warfare comes in many forms. You can start with the pervasive propaganda apparatus that the party has created on television, in the print media, on computer networks, the apps that you download, all pulsing the Chinese Communist Party line on any given subject. That is, especially if you live in China, it's in your face 24/7. Beyond that, you have the collection of capabilities that range from cyber warfare to the gathering of pervasive intelligence, the domination of global databases, to targeted operations that seek to compromise individuals and make, if they're a politician or a military official, make sure that they always make decisions that favor China's goals or favor the Chinese Communist Party. Cyber warfare is assisted by companies that dominate markets for computer components, like Huawei, telecommunications components. China has tried very hard to dominate global markets for 5G and pretty soon 6G in order to give its intelligence services much greater access to global electronic infrastructure. And when you have that kind of access that you can get through control of a 5G network, you're not just collecting data on the global population for which you can then sift out friends and enemies. You're also gaining access to the electronic infrastructure of a country. So that, let's say you want to attack Taiwan, if you control the electronic infrastructure there and you can turn off all the traffic lights and turn off all the power plants, then your ability to invade Taiwan and take it over becomes much easier. Ditto for any country that the Chinese will want to attack. And that will not just be countries on China's border very soon. Within 15 years, China will have the ability to send Marines or air mobile army forces to any country on Earth within a day or two. So if they want to send forces to Argentina, let's say, just for example, in order to ensure that the government remains pro-Chinese, then turning off the power plants except for the airport, so that they control the airport and send in troops, becomes an option. So the Chinese invest in all these capabilities for the goal of becoming the global hegemon. And all I can say, watching them for the last 20 years, is that they are making steady progress.
When it comes to this goal of becoming a global hegemon, I think to an extent some countries started seeing it during the outbreak of the CCP virus or COVID-19, for example. When Australia was calling for investigations into the origin of the virus, the Chinese Communist Party responded by threatening them and responded by attacking their business and financial interests. It went after, for example, governments in Europe, including Germany and others, and many countries began stating that the mask, this friendly mask that the CCP had worn previously, it seemed to have fallen off. Now, this trajectory that was revealed, this nature of the Chinese Communist Party that is willing to threaten other countries, in this case financially, could you see that escalating if just on an ideological ground a country deviates from the CCP's interest? Would they, in the way they're heading, respond more harshly to something like that? Or do you think it would be limited to, for example, turning off infrastructure, going after finances?
Well, indeed, the Chinese coronavirus has also revealed the harsh reality of a future Chinese hegemony, of a Pax Sinica. The Chinese Communist Party, we learned that in 2020, really believes that it is in a power position sufficient so that it has no hesitation to punish its critics. It has no hesitation of violating the sovereignty of any other country that angers the Chinese Communist Party. Australia has been a very visible target of Chinese Communist Party anger. They have attacked Australia's economy. They have mobilized United Front assets across Australia. The degree of Chinese Communist Party infiltration of the Australian political system has been exposed. And patriotic Australians for almost 3 years have responded and have made significant progress in putting the Chinese Communist Party at bay, creating new limits on their power and ability to manipulate politics in Australia. The job is not complete, but it is on the way, but it is being done. And Australia offers an example and encouragement to the rest of the world that defending your country from Chinese Communist Party predations is a job best done now, not in 10 or 15 years when China can invade you from the air or from the sea.
Now, Rich, we've seen something interesting with the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, terrible, but interesting in its own way as well, which is that business deals, government deals come with strings attached. We saw this, for example, during the virus outbreaks where they threatened countries' financial interests and ties to the CCP based on political interests. We've seen this, for example, with people going to China to do business, that you need to engage in some degree of corruption in order to do business in China, whether it's, for example, giving executive jobs to sons or daughters of Communist Party leaders or so on. We see as well, for example, that any kind of deal with the Chinese Communist Party, individual business, media, for example, Bloomberg News several years back wrote stories critical of the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP responded by threatening to kick out the Bloomberg financial terminals from China. meaning that the Chinese Communist Party, in order to maintain dominance, will use these deals people have created in order to exert influence over them. It's a two-way street. Now, of course, the CCP's potential control over politicians when it comes to deals that they or their family members have made, this is becoming one of the big points of discussion in the US right now. To what extent would the Chinese Communist Party expect something in return for that, and to what extent could they leverage deals like this?
Well, the Chinese Communist Party has viewed the American business sector and has created within the American business sector basically a phalanx of allies since the beginning of normalization of relations in the 1970s. And they've also created allies out of the business sectors of every other country that wants to invest in China or do business with China. It is quite a sight to behold. And the American business community has, until very recently, been one of the most reliable allies of the Chinese Communist Party in advancing favorable policies within the American Congress and the American government. This has changed only recently because of the overreach of the Chinese Communist Party. Their willingness to punish companies, individuals, their willingness to steal technology and not pay for it, not offer any compensation, and then to basically replicate a former American competitor and put that American company out of business. They've done that so many times that it is now regarded as foolish to try to even do a major business project with the Chinese. But that doesn't stop them. It doesn't stop them from trying to deploy economic power on a national level, as they've done against Australia. And should they ever achieve economic power or strength sufficiently greater than that of the United States, they will treat the United States the same way they've treated Australia. They will try to use all American economic contacts as weapons. And they will try to manipulate the health, the strength of the American economy, its ability to generate jobs and feed its people as well.
Rick Fisher, thanks again for being on Crossroads. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.